This is the FCB Radio Network, home of the best personalities and where real talk lives. Online at fcbradio.com. FCB.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to a mini episode of Just Listen to Yourself with Kira Davis. I am your host, Kira Davis, and if you're a fan of the show, you know that mini episodes are something new we've been trying. They've been going fantastic. The response has been great. It's a great way for me to hit quick topics without having to make a whole show about them. It's a great way for you to get my voice and point of view in little bites, and then also for me to invite other people to come on to the show, since during my regular shows, I don't care typically to interview people. It's just really about me talking to myself because I am my favorite person to talk to. So today I don't have a guest for you, but today I have my own. I've got some more coming up. Don't worry. They're in the hopper. But this week I had something that was really on my mind that I wanted to talk about because I found out something that shocked me. And maybe I'm naive. Like, I didn't know this existed before yesterday. So maybe you all out there have already heard of this. I've never heard of it. And I asked my husband if he had heard of this, and he also said he had never heard of it. I'm talking about race norming. Yes, race norming. What the hell is race norming? That was my reaction yesterday when this little innocent story from AP came across the wires on Twitter. It's part of my job. I monitor what's breaking, what news is breaking, what commentators are trending, and that's how we choose what we react to on my opinion website. And this headline came across from the AP. It says the NFL pledges to halt race norming and review black claims. What? My first reaction was, what? And that was pretty much the reaction from literally every single person on that tweet thread underneath that AP headline. Liberal, conservative, Republican, Democrat, like to a person, everybody was like, what? So, of course, I had to click on this article and I actually had to go digging. The AP was also quite to my mind, given that this is a huge revelation. To my mind, the AP was quite casual about how they were talking about race norming. And in the article, they were talking about it like I should already know what it was. So I actually had to go around digging up a little bit of stuff, of some of it from previous reporting at the AP. And what I found is that race norming is the assumption that black players have a lower cognitive function base. And so settlements on brain injury claims are calculated by adjusting for race. So what is happening now is that the NFL has been forced to establish this $1 billion fund to pay out players who have been injured cognitively, meaning who have had terrible brain injuries during the course of their career. And it was a big scandal. I'm sure you remember a lot of it. We all know that the game is dangerous. And yes, players do get compensated with their paychecks, but the NFL was doing a lot of shady stuff to hide how bad it was, what the consequences could have been, and really kind of threw these guys out on their own when they probably needed a lot more medical care, or even in some cases, therapeutic care, mental health care. So they got in big trouble for it. But now these two black players are suing the NFL saying, well, we deserve some money from this fund. We can't work now. We have cognitive difficulties because of the jobs that we did while playing. We deserve a piece of this fund, but the NFL keeps rejecting us based on this idea of race norming, which adjusts for our race. Basically, the way race norming works in the NFL is black people are too retarded to get brain injuries, right? It's harder to tell. That is basically what they're saying. It's harder to tell if a black person has suffered cognitive difficulties because they're already dumb. I don't know how else to say it. Just to put it in layman's terms, this is not what I believe. Please, nobody isolate this clip. And then next thing you know, Kira's on, I'm on CNN or TMZ or something. No, I'm not saying that. This is the NFL. This is their policy. That's what they're saying. And I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that the AP had so casually mentioned it. I was like, why isn't this a huge story? This is huge. This is blatant racism. Blatant. And given that we've just come through the summer BLM riots and we're now all focused on critical race theory and inclusion and diversity and yada, 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 this seems like a story ripe for the mainstream press. I honestly, and the mainstream press also hates the NFL, and they also hate Roger Goodell, right? Is that his name? I don't know much about the football, but Roger Goodell, right? He's the commissioner. They hate him because he's a conservative, and also he's a big perv. And the NFL had a little scuffle with the players over kneeling for the anthem. That's a subject I did on this show earlier this year. You can go back and hear my thoughts on that. And then the NFL came around, and then now they've been lecturing us about Black Lives Matter for the last 6 months and getting involved in all kinds of social justice issues, even though half their fan base isn't really into it. So it just seemed inconceivable that this was not a huge story and that the AP of all places was just dropping this as if it was nothing. To my mind, as a seasoned opinion journalist on the conservative side, that tells me there's something going on here. So I dug. And I found a really great piece from this writer who, let me pull it up here. His name is Dave Zirin, and he was writing at The Nation, and he wrote an article called, "So What the Hell is Race Norming?" which was literally my thought when I read that AP line. So thank you, Dave, for writing it. He wrote it back in March. And I thought, gosh, this should have been a big story back then, too. Why isn't Dave Zirin a huge, famous political writer? I mean, he was one of the few people that I found writing on the subject. And the article was really great. The article was very illuminating. Reading his article, I found out why the AP and other outlets were just sort of letting this slide and not really talking about the horrific practice of race norming. As it turns out, race norming is a liberal policy from the Carter administration meant to help Black people. Yes. I'll read you what Zirin says. Now, Zirin, this guy is obviously a liberal. And I'm a conservative, as you know. As you guys listen to this show, y'all know. And so I know that when something favors conservatism or something proves conservatism right, you can't say that as a liberal writer. You can't say that. So Zirin is trying to tap dance around the horrific nature of this policy while still kind of putting it on conservatives. So this is the angle that I'm reading this to you from. Just so you know, I'm just setting the I don't care what Zirin. I'm glad he wrote this. I don't really care what his angle is. He's a typical liberal to me, so there's nothing shocking about how he feels about any of this. I'm not offended by anything, but I just wanted you to know the context. So here's a sliver of what he wrote. The practice of race norming harkens back 40 years when aptitude scores as a part of federal jobs applications were adjusted to account for the race and ethnicity of the person taking the test. It was an admission that these tests were in fact racially biased. Race norming was first used by the Carter administration and then further implemented and extended by Reagan in 1981. Rhino, he put that, not me, before being subsequently outlawed by George H.W. Bush's so-called Civil Rights Act of 1991. Again, the purpose of, quote, race norming was actually to counteract racial bias in aptitude tests. In other words, its goal was to correct racist practices, not implement them. Race norming soon became a juicy target for the right wing, called by George Will liberalism's apartheid of compassion. It's a side note. George Will, he went like a little bit crazy. Trump broke a lot of people, and George Will was one of them, but he certainly did have a way with the words. I like that. Liberalism's apartheid of compassion. The Bow-Tied One further wrote in his 1991 syndicated column that such remedies so obviously poison society. For Will and his ilk, attempted cures are always the scourge, while racism itself gets to fester without even a scant critique. And yet, Mr. Zirin, it turns out that George Will was right, because he wrote that in 1991, and in 2021, his prediction has come true. Zirin did not offer George Will an apology at any point, and in fact only blamed George Will further throughout this article, but I thought that was so fascinating. First of all, kudos to you, Zirin, for digging it up and printing it. Because we're living in a time now where the New York Times, the paper of record, is actually going back and retroactively changing headlines. So now that it's turning out that Trump was right about a lot of the COVID stuff and a lot of what he was saying about treatments and vaccines and where it came from. And now the New York Times is going back and scrubbing their old headlines. So kudos to Zirin for letting that stand and standing by it. I get it. You know, he's not going to be able to credit Will with being right here, and he never will. But he deserves some recognition for doing the work that nobody else was doing. I wasn't even doing this. I didn't know it existed. You know, so thank you, Mr. Zirin, for publicizing this, because I didn't even know this existed, but I knew my instincts were right. Because, see, there was something fishy. Why wouldn't the AP take this opportunity to completely excoriate Roger Goodell in the NFL? Why I know they do mostly straight up news, but even still, just it wasn't dropped as a hot piece of news. It was just casually thrown out there. And why didn't any of the other liberal outlets pick it up and make a big deal out of it and talk about how, yeah, black lives, see how little Black lives matter to the NFL? Roger Goodell, he's a racist. He's everything we said he was. Look at what they're doing. Now I know why, but there's two pieces here that are disturbing me and what I want to chat about. One piece of this is that the media has been so disingenuous about all of this, about every piece of news that has come out of mainstream media for the last 4 to 5 years. I've never seen anything like it. I got off Facebook this year after January because Facebook was banning people even for saying things on their personal pages. They were getting their business pages banned or suspended. And I'm outspoken and I didn't want to risk it. But the other thing was that I was watching a lot of my family and friends post horrible things about how conservatives should be censored and the right wing should be censored. They all know what I do for a living, all of them. And I just thought, is this what they think of me? You know, that they really think I should be censored. They don't even really listen to things I say. And they don't know that their words are making my job much harder. Because now we're having to contend with keeping our jobs just for calling what happened at the Capitol a protest versus a riot. Like, Facebook was yanking us for stuff like that. So it's just so egregious, and I was so righteously indignant. And rather than tell every person off every day when I had to read their stupid posts about news stories that I know they didn't read, because I can tell if you've read it by how you frame, and usually people just read the headlines. But me and my job and what we have to do at my work, I know about these stories. I know what's going on. But they were happy to believe me a liar just because of my ideology, and it stung. And I was like, I don't want to stick around for this. So I left Facebook. But I think about going back a lot, because in the last few days, everything I told them that was happening before I left Facebook, everything I said about, hey, you guys, you need to look beyond the headlines. There's some truth here. You can't let your political bias keep you from seeing the truth or keep you from sharing the truth, or allow the media to keep the truth from you. You can't do that, even if it's inconvenient and it doesn't support your narrative. It's okay for us to do this. And now, of course, we're finding out, oh, yeah, the media did cover up. Like, now they're having to admit, yeah, okay, we did cover up the lab leak stuff from China because Trump was saying it. And, well, he's a racist, so we just didn't want to give him. Like, that's not journalism. Even if you think that's true, even if you think, well, when Trump said it, he meant Chinese people are bad and because he was a racist. Okay, fine. But, like, that's not your job as a journalist to decide what information gets out, just because you don't like the person who it validates, whose opinion it validates. It's just shocking. So one aspect of this for me was like how the media will cover up the truth. When I say the media, I'm talking about mainstream media, because I'm the media, right? But I'm right-wing media, which is alternative media, really, and still is to this day, unless you're on Fox News. It's changing, but I'm talking about progressive media or corporate media, That's another word people use for it, legacy media. And from the Hunter Biden story to the lab leak story to Fauci emails. I mean, my goodness, in those Fauci this isn't a show about Fauci, but this is a show about covering up valid information. In the Fauci emails, he talks about the superiority of hydroxychloroquine treatment. Because the word came out of Trump's mouth, suddenly it was a hoax. It was a hoax treatment, which shocked me because, like, I know people with lupus who are on hydroxychloroquine. Like, it is a drug that is used now commonly. And it just shows the media bias. Like, one outlet painted that as a crazy thing to say. And then everybody was like, well, Trump's crazy. So obviously this treatment is crazy. And now, of course, we're finding out that Fauci never thought that. He thought that that was a proper and appropriate thing to try. So the media has covered up so much vital information for no other reason than they just didn't want the other side to have like a win or and I told you so. And that's one thing to do with your friends, and that's one thing to do with your husband and your wife. But when you're the media, when it's your job to inform people, and not only that, but your job to expose corruption, and you willingly cover up stories because you don't want to give your ideological opposites a win, that's disgusting. And that ends up hurting people, just like this story on race norming. You know what? This story should be a frickin' scandal. This should be everywhere. It should be all we're talking about right now. It really should be. But it's not. And not because there's other things going on. It's because the mainstream media doesn't want it to be. And that's what happens when you choose ideology over information. When you choose ideology over truth, over reason. That's what happens. You will hurt people. The press has the opportunity to be champions for these men, to be champions for black people, for us. Race norming is abhorrent. But see, it was born out of the liberal mind. And I could have told you, just like George Will told you, that this wasn't going to work. It was never going to work. You can't correct. Humans do not have the ability to correct sin. Do you understand me? Are you listening to me? Humans do not have the ability to correct sin. We can repent, which means turn away, straighten up, fly right. We can do better. We can be better. But we cannot correct sin. There is only one who can correct sin, and we are not him. So when we try to correct sin, that will always lead to more sin because we are sinful creatures. That's why these decisions should not be in our hands. That's why critical race theory is such a scourge. It aims to be a correction for sin. And when humans try to correct the rot that is original sin, we're always going to overcorrect or undercorrect. We're never going to do it right. It takes a perfect person to defeat sin. And so of course this was going to happen. But see, they don't want to admit that their way of looking at it is wrong because then you kind of validate a guy like George Will who doesn't like solutions to racism. But I would argue that George Will, I don't know anything about the man now, but at that time I would argue that George Will wasn't saying that racism didn't need to be solved. What he was saying is this ain't it. This won't be a solution. And I think that's why a lot of liberals think that we conservatives don't want to solve racism. I mean, there are conservatives out there who don't care about racism and don't think that it's a big deal. So I get that. But like, generally speaking, I think a lot of liberals think, well, you conservatives don't want to solve racism because every solution we come up with, you push back on. But it's like, no, every solution you come up with is bad. Because it starts off from the assumption that human beings can correct sin instead of being something that weaves policy, human behavior, and free will. So that is part of what really disturbs me about this story, that it's not a huge story, and that it's not a huge story because it was a liberal policy that backfired, which it always was going to be. This is why I did do an episode on affirmative action, right, guys? Yeah, I did. And I said, I'm not in favor of it, but there are a lot of conservatives I know who are in favor of affirmative action. A lot of white conservatives that I know. That is the truth. But I don't favor it, but I understand why we need it or why it was needed and why people would argue for it. Like, there's a good case for it. But ultimately, I don't approve of it because of this very thing, because of race norming, because what happens is these things always blow up in our faces. Not white folks' faces, not y'all's. They always blow up in our faces. When you try to tinker with human nature instead of work with it. What a shock. I just can't believe that this isn't a humongous scandal. Here's the other thing. This is why we should not be leaving it up to government to solve racism. Does this mean the government has no job at all in any of this? No, I don't think that, because obviously there were decisions that we needed the mechanics of government to get involved in, desegregation in some places, although it was the capitalistic market really that accelerated desegregation. We'll go into that on another episode, but or schools, integrating schools or whatever. The government has a place, especially when the government needs to restore rights that it's taken. That's the government's got to take their hands off, right? That requires some level of involvement. So I understand that, but when we leave solving racism in the hands of government, we will always get this soft bigotry of low expectations. How on earth did any black person, well, I'm going to assume no black person looked at these policies, but how on earth could any black person look at the policy and say, yeah, okay, this is a great solution for the disparity of racial representation in government jobs. This is great. I'm too stupid to compete with a white person on their level, so you just lower the bar for me. And we keep doing that. Like in Florida, they're getting rid of AP courses across the United States because rather than say, why aren't we educating black children to the level of this course? We're like, well, they can't be educated because they're too dumb. Oh my gosh. It's just like, and then they lower the bar, and then it's like, they've changed math scores in some states. I think they did this in Florida a while back, changed math scores for black students so that lower scores are higher grades. I mean, it's just grossly, unfathomably offensive, astounding. This should be the biggest story. I mean, can you imagine if the story went, because Mr. Zirin here had to get Reagan's name in here, right? Couldn't let Carter just hang on to that. Reagan had a Democrat Congress. So some things Reagan did that he had to work with Congress for that weren't necessarily Reagan's thing. And the same with Clinton. Clinton gets a lot of credit for reaching across the aisle and stuff like liberals like to bring up Clinton, like, oh, he reduced taxes and blah, blah. No, the Republican Congress reduced that stuff. He didn't have any other choice. Anyways, it just, the idea that we would squash something so huge because it was enacted by a liberal or a Democrat president is, we should all be scared of that notion. We should be scared that what's happening right now in society is that our information, the information that we accept from the press, is being dictated by their ideology. That should be frightening, that ideology is keeping the press from pursuing important stories that if we could have honestly reported on this virus from the start, we probably could have taken action way quicker. Nancy Pelosi was out there Chinese New Year's telling people to go to Chinatown and hug all your Asian friends. And then like a week later, we're in lockdown for a year. I mean, we could have avoided that if the press would have done their job and honestly dug into where this virus came from and why it came to our shores and how we could stop it. We had a president who wanted to close our borders, and because our ideological differences got in the way. We weren't allowed to have an honest conversation about why that would be healthy for America. Rather than to lock down the whole country, we should just lock out the rest of the world until they get their stuff together. That was not a solution that was allowed to be discussed because of ideology, not because of truth. This race norming thing is shocking to me. It is absolutely shocking. And especially after all of this Black Lives Matter stuff that we've all been through, and race has been at the forefront of everything right now. And even the NFL has changed their tune and is now lecturing us, the customers, about how we're not open-minded enough. We need to be educated with commercials and commercial breaks and ad campaigns and kneeling players, whatever the hell is going on in the NFL. They need to educate us because we're the dummies. And look what they're doing. This is pathetic. And this is not, and I know that Mr. Zirin's point here is like, hey, this was a policy that began with good intentions. Yeah, we know where good intentions lead you. The road to hell is paved with them. Any policy that has good intentions, you should run far away from. You don't want good intentions. You want results. And guess what? The good intentions didn't get what they wanted. Just like George Will and probably a lot of other people on the right said they wouldn't. Because you cannot correct a lie with another lie. You cannot correct the lie that black people are somehow dumber than white people. You cannot correct that lie with the lie that black people can achieve if you just lower the bar for them. That's a lie too. No one achieves when you lower bars. People get lazy that way. It's actually what happens. So kudos to these players. I wish them well in their lawsuit. I hope this gets appealed. This is disgusting. The NFL should be shamed to no end for this. And frankly, every liberal who thought that this policy was a good idea needs to be held to account for it. You answer for this. You answer for it. Give me an answer. Give me a good one about why I should forget about what this policy ended up doing just because you thought it was going to do something good. And how could you think it was going to do something good, by the way? How dare you? How dare you sign on for this? How dare you sign on for the thought that black people are dumber and so should be measured cognitively at a lower level than white people? How freaking dare you? You're not my friend. You're not on my side. Give me a break. Some of you owe us an apology. And if you have a good reason for why I should believe your good intentions on this policy and not pay attention to what's happening to these players in the NFL now who are now getting denied their due justice because they're, quote, too dumb to have brain injuries, if you can justify that, please write me, JLTY@protonmail.com. JLTY@protonmail.com. As a matter of fact, if you have a justification for it, I'll bring you on this show and we'll do a mini episode together. I dare you.
Politics are becoming more and more divisive every day. My name is Colin Jackson. I'm the co-host of Not Another Political Podcast, where we reject popular opinions and prioritize solutions over partisan dogma. Download Not Another Political Podcast on iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcast entertainment today.
All right, guys, that is it for me for this mini episode this week. Passionate, quick hit. Let me know what you think. You heard the email address. Don't forget, we've got regular episodes, of course. This week's episode was on colorblindness. Now, these kind of go hand in hand, right? There's two big race issues, but colorblindness, I'm already getting a lot of feedback from that one. So I knew I would. So no hard feelings. And of course, the JLTY audience is very informed and intelligent and expressive. So I'm definitely not scared of anything. But yeah, I'm definitely getting a lot of feedback from that one. So you can go ahead and jump into this fray. Thanks for joining us. And don't forget, every once in a while, just stop and listen to yourself.
The FCB Radio Network. First class broadcasting worldwide.